The device is 8 feet of oak timber with iron rollers at each end, smooth from decades of use, greased so they turn slowly, precisely. Fast would be merciful. Slow is the point. The prisoner lies on their back, wrists bound with wet hemp rope that won't stretch, ankles the same, each limb tied to a separate roller. The torturer takes position at one end. The inquisitor watches. A notary sits ready to document everything. The friar stands close, voice calm, asking if they're ready to confess. The prisoner denies the charge. The torturer begins to turn the crank. First rotation tightens the slack. Second rotation removes any illusion this will be bearable. The body stretches. Every joint registers the wrongness. Shoulders, elbows, spine, hips, knees, ankles, all being pulled in directions they weren't designed to move. 3 rotations. Serious pain now. Joints forced past normal range. Cartilage compressed. Tendons stretched beyond their limit. The prisoner begins to understand this won't stop at discomfort. The friar asks again, "Do you practice the forbidden faith? Name the others." The prisoner gasps out another denial. The torturer turns the crank. 4 rotations. 5. Heart racing, pupils dilated. Every nerve screaming that damage is occurring, but death isn't approaching. Death would be mercy. At 6 rotations, the prisoner hears the first sound from inside their own body. A wet creaking, like a tree branch bending, living tissue deforming past the point where it can return to its original shape. The sound travels through bone directly to the inner ear. They're listening to themselves come apart. The psychological impact of this sound bypasses rational thought. It's not just pain, it's hearing your skeleton crack. The torturer heard it too, was waiting for it, considers it progress. 7 rotations. The shoulders begin to dislocate, balls separating from socket, joint capsule tearing, labrum rupturing, ligaments snapping, rotator cuff shredding. The pain overwhelms every other input. The prisoner screams. Not words, just raw animal sound. It echoes off stone walls, reaches the corridor where others wait, teaching them what's coming. 8 rotations. 9. Hips separate. Spine elongates. The prisoner feels their body getting longer, feels spaces between vertebrae widening. Sometimes the discs rupture entirely, leaking into surrounding tissue, pressing on nerves. At 10 rotations, something gives way. A shoulder separating completely, a hip joint failing. Everyone hears it, sharp crack or wet tearing. The notary writes it down, time, location, prisoner's response. Everything documented. This is the dry rack, pure mechanical force. But the Inquisition developed a refinement, the water rack. Before stretching begins, the prisoner is forced to drink gallons of water. Stomach distends like a balloon, pressing against the diaphragm. Then they're placed on the rack. As the body stretches, the distended stomach compresses from multiple directions. The water has nowhere to go. Pressure builds. Many vomit violently, aspirating water into their lungs, choking while their joints pull apart. Some suffer stomach ruptures, internal bleeding that kills them days later. The records are extensive and meticulous. The Inquisition kept ledgers. Dates, names, charges, duration, confessions obtained. These documents survive in Spanish archives. Thousands of pages. Each entry a small bureaucratic notation of enormous suffering. Valencia, 1519. Catalina Muñoz, accused of secret Jewish practices. 3 sessions over 2 weeks. First, 37 minutes, no confession. Second, 52 minutes confessed to lighting Sabbath candles, named no one. Third, 1 hour, 14 minutes. The notary recorded, her left shoulder became wholly separated, and she confessed to all charges and named 6 others. She never used her left arm again. The 6 people she named were arrested. 3 were tortured. The chain reaction spread. Seville, 1481. Gonzalo de Cordoba, on the water rack. 2 gallons of water consumed. Stretched for approximately 5 minutes. Both shoulders dislocated, he voided himself copiously from both mouth and bowels. Confessed to Jewish dietary laws, named 14 family members, 12 arrested, 5 burned at the stake. Gonzalo strangled before burning as mercy for cooperation. His property seized. The long-term disabilities were catastrophic. Chronic joint instability, nerve damage causing loss of sensation and motor control, spinal damage resulting in paralysis. Many couldn't work, couldn't care for themselves, and as marked heretics they were forbidden from most employment, required to wear identifying garments. The rack destroyed their futures. Physician Andres Laguna, mid-1500s, examined prisoners after sessions. His notes describe arms that hang without strength, spine curved in unnatural fashion, constant trembling and pain that no poultice or bleeding can relieve. Many developed infections in damaged joints that proved fatal weeks or months later. The famous cases are few because the Inquisition generally didn't torture the powerful, but there are exceptions. Gabriel de Granada, converso physician who treated the Spanish court, arrested at 63 in 1492. Accused by a competitor, tortured despite his age and connections. The session lasted until the setting of the sun, several hours. Both shoulders, both hips, separated, he confessed to all charges with great weeping, and could not stand or walk without assistance thereafter. Lived 4 more years as an invalid. One testimony breaks through the official records. Beatriz, tortured in 1501, testified years later in civil court. The pain was such that I believed my soul was being torn from my body. I heard the sound of my bones parting, and I knew I was being destroyed. I confessed to things I had not done and accused people I had never met because I would have said anything to make it stop. The rack was the foundation of the Inquisition's torture program, the standard, the baseline. When the manuals discussed ordinary torture, they meant the rack. Everything else was variation or escalation. The rack is still with us. Not the physical device, those are in museums behind velvet ropes. But the principle, that inflicting calibrated increments of physical pain can break psychological resistance and extract compliance. It changed names, changed methods, adapted to new technologies. But the core concept that the human body can be used as a lever against the human mind, that remains operational in interrogation rooms in far more recent times than we'd like to admit. There's a pulley mounted in the ceiling, iron anchored into a massive oak beam installed specifically to bear the weight of suspended bodies. The sheave is worn smooth from decades of rope running through it. Below, bolted into the stone floor, is an iron ring where the torturer stands. The mechanics are simple. The prisoner's hands are brought behind their back and the wrists bound together, not loosely lashed, with multiple wraps of thick hemp rope pulled tight enough that circulation cuts off immediately. The binding rope extends upward, threads through the ceiling pulley, and the free end goes to the torturer. The torturer pulls. The prisoner rises. For the first few inches, they can still touch the ground with their toes, still support some weight through their legs. This is the last moment their body functions within normal parameters, the last moment before everything goes wrong. The torturer pulls harder. The feet leave the ground. The entire body weight, 100 to 200 pounds, transfers to the wrists and shoulders, but the arms are behind the back, rotated inward and upward, forcing maximum stress on the rotator cuff. The shoulder is a ball and socket joint, but unlike the hip, the socket is shallow. The trade-off for range of motion is vulnerability. The joint is held together primarily by soft tissue, muscles, tendons, ligaments. Suspending a body by wrists behind the back loads all that soft tissue in the worst possible way. Within 60 seconds, the prisoner is in agony. Their own body weight pulls the upper arm bone downward and forward, while the rope holds the forearm upward and backward. The rotator cuff stretches to its limit, trying to hold the joint together. This isn't like hanging from a bar by your hands. This is categorically different. At 2 minutes, the supraspinatus tendon starts to tear. Microscopic disruptions in collagen fibers at first, but cumulative and irreversible. The prisoner feels it as deep, grinding pain inside the shoulder, like the architecture of the body itself is failing. At 5 minutes, the shoulders begin to sublux, partial dislocation where the ball starts sliding out of the socket. The joint capsule stretches. The labrum tears. The pain crosses into territory the nervous system can't properly process. It becomes electrical overload, a signal so intense it overwhelms the brain's ability to think about anything else. But the strapado is dynamic. After the prisoner has hung for several minutes, after the shoulders have begun failing, after the screaming subsides into gasping sobs, the torturer asks the questions, "Do you practice the forbidden faith? Will you name others?" When the prisoner refuses or names too few names, the torturer doesn't argue. He simply releases the rope. The prisoner falls 4 or 5 feet, and the rope catches with a violent jerk. This is squassation, the drop variant. This is where partial dislocations become complete. The physics are straightforward. The falling body stops abruptly. For a 150-pound person, the force on the shoulders during the jerk can exceed 750 pounds. No soft tissue can withstand that. The shoulder joint separates completely. Ball pulls out of socket. Joint capsule tears. Labrum ruptures. Ligaments snap. Often the bone where rotator cuff muscles attach fractures and separates. Witnesses describe a sickening pop, followed by pain that causes unconsciousness in about 1/3 of cases. But unconsciousness is temporary. Adrenaline brings them back within 30 to 60 seconds. They wake still suspended, both shoulders completely dislocated, arms hanging at grotesque angles, hands numb and useless, and they know the torturer can drop them again and again. Records document squassation repeated 10, 15, 20 times in single sessions. Each drop caused additional damage. After shoulders dislocated, elbows hyperextended. Wrists developed fractures. Upper back and neck muscles tore themselves apart trying to stabilize destroyed shoulders. With each drop, psychological resistance crumbled because the prisoner learned there was no bottom to this. No point where the torturer would say, "Enough." Only the question, the refusal, the drop, the explosion of pain, repeated until they said whatever words would make it stop. The basic strapado could be enhanced. Adding weights to the prisoner's feet increased destructive force proportionally. A 20-pound weight increased the load by 20 pounds during suspension, and approximately 100 pounds during the drop. A 50-pound weight destroyed shoulders in minutes rather than tens of minutes. The weights were carved stones with holes drilled through for rope, graded by weight, stored with other implements. The Inquisitor specified which weight based on charge severity, previous resistance, sometimes whim. Everything documented. Accounts exist of weights exceeding 100 pounds in extreme cases. At that load, shoulders dislocated immediately. The drop caused fractures in collarbones, ribs. It turned the strapado from torture into something closer to execution, except it took hours and the prisoner remained conscious for most of it. The physical damage was comprehensive and permanent. In the 16th century, there was no surgical repair. The shoulder might be reduced, ball pushed back into socket, but torn tendons didn't heal. The joint remained unstable. Many survivors couldn't raise their arm above shoulder height ever again. Some lost all movement. The limb hung useless, muscles atrophied, hand became clawed and contracted. Nerve damage was almost universal. The brachial plexus, nerves running from spine through shoulder down the arm, was stretched and compressed during suspension. Nerves don't recover well from mechanical trauma. Prisoners developed permanent numbness, tingling, burning pain, nothing could relieve. Some lost motor control entirely. The psychological damage was equally severe. The prisoner's own body weight became the weapon. They weren't being cut or burned by external force. They were being destroyed by gravity. And they could see the pulley, see the rope, knew exactly what was coming. The anticipation became its own torture. Recovery was impossible for most. A merchant who couldn't lift his arms couldn't work. A woman who couldn't raise her hands couldn't cook, weave, care for children. And as marked heretics, they were barred from charity, left to beg or starve, visible reminders of what happened to those who resisted. The Inquisitor protocols were codified in manuals. The 1578 Directorium Inquisitorum specified graduated increments: threat of torture, binding hands, partial suspension, full suspension, addition of weights, the drop. Each stage gave opportunity to confess before the next escalation, each designed to be worse than expected. The manual explicitly states effectiveness depends on the prisoner's belief it will continue to get worse. The protocols required a physician present to monitor condition and certify the torture wasn't life-threatening. Not mercy, legal protection. Ecclesiastical law technically forbade torture causing death or permanent mutilation. The physician's signature transformed brutality into lawful procedure. The bureaucracy sanitized the violence. Toledo Tribunal, 1491. Maria de los Angeles, 28, married, mother of 3. Accused of secret Islamic practices, denied charges. Suspended for the length of time required to recite the Ave Maria 5 times. 3 to 4 minutes. No weights. Dropped once. Both shoulders dislocated. She screamed, "Ay Dios, me matan, me matan. Oh God, they are killing me." She confessed, admitted to fasting during Ramadan, Islamic prayer, teaching children Quranic verses, named 7 women, all arrested. 3 confessed under threat. 2 tortured and confessed. 2 maintained innocence, burned at the stake. Maria reconciled, sentenced to wear the San Benito 2 years. The record notes, she could not use her arms to embrace her children when she returned home and wept bitterly at this. Her children, now marked as offspring of a reconciled heretic, were barred from university, public office, religious orders. The strappado destroyed not just Maria, but her children's futures. The device sits in the corner of the chamber, like a grotesque piece of furniture. It's a wooden pyramid, essentially. A triangular structure mounted on a sturdy frame, the apex pointing upward. The point at the top is perhaps 2 inches wide at its broadest, tapering to a blunted edge. Some versions have a genuine point, others are slightly rounded. The difference is academic because both versions accomplish the same thing. The prisoner is brought to the device, stripped of clothing. This isn't for humiliation, though that's certainly part of it. This is practical. Clothing would provide cushioning, however minimal, and cushioning interferes with the intended function. They're positioned above the pyramid with ropes or chains attached to a pulley system. Their ankles are bound, and then they're lowered slowly, very slowly, until the point of the pyramid makes contact with the perineum, the area between the genitals and the anus, one of the most nerve-dense and sensitive regions of the human body. The initial contact is merely uncomfortable. The point presses against flesh. The prisoner can still shift slightly, can still adjust their position minutely to distribute the pressure. But then the lowering continues, inch by inch. The prisoner's body weight begins to rest on the point, and the point begins to penetrate. Not deeply at first. The human body has some give to it. Skin compresses. Tissue deforms. But there's a limit to how much compression is possible before structural damage begins, and the Judas cradle is designed to find that limit and exceed it methodically. After 10 minutes, the pressure is excruciating. The point is compressing nerves, crushing blood vessels, deforming muscle and connective tissue. The prisoner is experiencing pain from an area of the body that's wired to detect the slightest injury and magnify it into overwhelming signals. And there's no relief position. They can't shift their weight to their legs because their legs are bound and dangling. They can't support themselves with their arms because their arms are restrained. They can sit on the point, or they can be pulled slightly upward by the ropes. And being pulled upward only provides relief for as long as the torturer maintains the tension. After 30 minutes, the tissue begins to break down. Skin splits. Shallow penetration becomes deeper penetration. Blood flow to the compressed area is cut off, causing tissue death that will continue even after the torture ends. And the prisoner is beginning to understand that this isn't a brief session. The Judas cradle isn't designed for minutes. It's designed for hours. Records indicate sessions lasting 6, 8, 12 hours. Some prisoners were left on the device overnight. The body doesn't adapt to this kind of pressure. It doesn't develop tolerance. The pain increases as tissue damage accumulates. Muscles cramp from the forced position. Circulation in the legs is compromised, and the wound where the point presses continues to deepen. Internal injuries were common and severe. The point could penetrate deep enough to damage the rectum, the bladder, the urethra. Infections were almost guaranteed because 16th century torture chambers were not sterile environments. The device itself was rarely cleaned between uses. The wood absorbed blood and other fluids, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria. Every prisoner placed on the cradle was exposed to pathogens from every previous prisoner. The infections that developed were catastrophic: pelvic infections, sepsis, gangrene. Many prisoners who survived the Judas cradle died days or weeks later from infection-related complications. The physicians who examined prisoners post-torture documented fevers, suppurating wounds, tissue necrosis. There was no effective treatment. Antibiotics wouldn't exist for another 400 years. Sleep deprivation compounded the torture. A prisoner on the Judas cradle couldn't sleep. The pain prevented it. Any relaxation of muscles caused the body to settle more heavily onto the point, intensifying the pain and jolting the prisoner back to full consciousness. For sessions lasting multiple hours or overnight, the accumulated effects of pain plus sleep deprivation caused hallucinations, delirium, complete psychological breakdown. Some versions of the device incorporated heated metal points instead of wood. The point would be removed from the frame, heated in a brazier until red hot, then reinstalled. The prisoner would be lowered onto a point that was hot enough to cause immediate third-degree burns. In addition to the mechanical trauma, the smell of burning flesh filled the chamber. The sound of tissue sizzling was audible, and the burn wounds, infected almost immediately, caused damage that extended far beyond the initial contact point. The sanitation issues weren't accidental oversights. They were understood and accepted. The Inquisition's records occasionally reference the need to clean the instruments, but these references are rare. More common are entries noting that prisoners developed fevers or corruption of the flesh after torture sessions. The connection between filthy instruments and infection was understood at some level, but cleanliness wasn't prioritized because prisoner health wasn't the goal. Confession was the goal. Whether the prisoner survived to be reconciled or died in the process was secondary. The documentation in Inquisition records is sparse for the Judas cradle compared to more common methods like the rack or strappado. This may be because the device was used less frequently, reserved for prisoners who had resisted other methods. Or it may be because the damage it caused was difficult to describe in the clinical language the notaries used. How do you bureaucratically document someone being slowly impaled over the course of 12 hours? The entries that do exist are brief and euphemistic, applied to the wooden horse for a period extending from Vespers to Compline, evening prayers to night prayers, approximately 4 hours. Placed upon the triangle until confession was obtained. Subject displayed great anguish and confessed after sustaining injury to the lower body. One account from Barcelona, 1515, is more detailed. A man named Jomi, accused of Catharism, was subjected to the Judas cradle after refusing to confess on the rack. The record states he was placed on the device at midday and remained there until the following dawn, roughly 18 hours. He confessed after approximately 10 hours, but the session continued because the Inquisitor wanted names of other heretics. Jamo provided 12 names. When he was removed from the device, the notary recorded that he could neither stand nor walk and was carried to his cell. He died 6 days later. The official cause was recorded as natural causes. The 12 people he named were all arrested. The Judas cradle represents a particular category of Inquisition torture, methods designed not for quick confession extraction but for absolute psychological destruction. It was slow. It was inexorable. It offered no moment of peak intensity after which relief might come. It just continued, hour after hour, the pain building, the damage accumulating, until the prisoner said anything required to make it stop. And like all Inquisition methods, it was legal. It was approved. It was documented. Men implemented it and went home to their families. The device was maintained, stored properly, kept in working order for the next prisoner. The bureaucracy of torture transformed an act of unspeakable cruelty into routine procedure. The auto da fe wasn't torture in the conventional sense. It was execution. But it was execution designed to maximize suffering extend dying, and create public spectacle that would terrorize entire populations into compliance. The event was announced weeks in advance. Printed notices posted in public squares, announcements from church pulpits. Everyone was expected to attend. Not invited, expected. Failure to appear could itself raise suspicion of heretical sympathies. The day began with procession. The condemned wore sanbenitos, yellow tunics painted with flames and demons. They carried green candles. They were paraded through streets from the prison to the plaza, surrounded by officials, priests, soldiers. Crowds lined the route. Some threw stones, some spat. Some wept. The procession could last hours, winding through the city so maximum number of people would witness the condemned and their degradation. The plaza was prepared like theater, a raised platform for nobility and church officials, seating areas for important citizens, standing room for commoners. Street vendors sold food, drink. People arrived early to secure good viewing positions. Children were brought. This wasn't considered inappropriate. This was education. This was demonstration of what happened to enemies of the faith. The condemned were led to stakes driven into the ground, each stake surrounded by bundled wood. They were bound to the stakes with chains or thick rope. Then the priests made final appeals. Confess. Recant. Return to the true faith. Even now, at this final moment, confession could earn mercy. The mercy was the garrote, a metal collar placed around the neck with a screw mechanism at the back. The executioner would turn the screw, tightening the collar, compressing the throat, cutting off air and blood flow to the brain. Death by strangulation typically took 3 to 5 minutes. Not quick, not painless, but considerably less agonizing than burning alive. Prisoners who confessed at the stake were strangled before the fire was lit. They died by suffocation, then their corpses were burned. This was considered merciful. This was the reward for last-minute repentance. Prisoners who refused to confess, who maintained innocence or remained silent, received no garrote. They were burned alive. The fire was built deliberately. Green wood was used, wood that hadn't been dried, wood with high moisture content. Green wood produces enormous amounts of thick, choking smoke before it builds to killing temperature. This meant the condemned would suffocate slowly in smoke before flames reached them, or endure the fire's increasing heat for 20, 30, sometimes 40 minutes before death finally came. The pyres weren't designed for quick immolation. They were designed for extended dying. The wood was stacked to burn from the outside in, so flames reached the prisoner's feet and legs first, burning slowly upward. The condemned experienced their extremities catching fire while their torso and head remained untouched, fully conscious, fully aware of what was happening and what was coming next. Smoke inhalation killed some before the flames reached vital organs, but not all. Some prisoners were positioned on slightly elevated platforms within the pyre, keeping their heads above the initial smoke layer. Some were bound facing into the wind, so smoke blew away from their faces. These weren't random variations. These were deliberate choices made by executioners experienced in prolonging the process. The timeline from ignition to death varied enormously. Fast deaths, 10 to 15 minutes, occurred when dry wood was used accidentally or when prisoners were positioned low in the pyre where smoke concentration was highest. Slow deaths, 30 to 45 minutes, occurred when everything was done according to protocol. Green wood, elevated positioning, wind direction considered. The longest recorded death took over an hour. The prisoner, a woman named Elvira, was documented as crying out to God and the saints until her voice was silenced by the flames consuming her throat. The crowd watched everything. Nobility sat in elevated boxes, close enough to see detail but far enough to avoid smoke and heat. They drank wine. They conversed. They critiqued the performance like theater critics. That one died too quickly. The executioner positioned them poorly. Diplomatic guests were often invited to major auto-da-fe events. Foreign ambassadors wrote reports home describing the spectacle. Some expressed horror. Some expressed admiration for Spanish religious devotion. Some brought children on their shoulders for better views. Some made it a social occasion, meeting friends, sharing food. Others came out of genuine religious fervor, believing they were witnessing God's justice enacted on earth. Still others came because failure to attend could mark them as suspects. The statistics vary by region and era. In the Inquisition's first decades, 1480s to 1500s, burnings were frequent, sometimes dozens at a single auto da fe. Seville, 1481, 24 people burned in one day. Toledo, 1486, 750 people burned over the course of the year. These numbers dropped in later centuries as the initial wave of terror accomplished its goal, and fewer people openly resisted. Overall, historians estimate 3,000 to 5,000 people were burned at the stake during the Spanish Inquisition's 356-year operation. That number seems almost modest compared to death tolls from wars or plagues of the same era, but the impact can't be measured in deaths alone. Every burning was witnessed by thousands. Every burning sent a message to entire regions. And every burning was preceded by torture, by imprisonment, by investigation that destroyed families and communities. Notable victims left records that survive. Maria de Cazalla, educated woman who corresponded with Erasmus, arrested for Lutheran sympathies, tortured but not burned, reconciled instead. Elvira del Campo, burned 1568 for Judaizing practices, maintained innocence until flames silenced her. Francisco de Vitoria, professor at Salamanca, investigated but never charged, died of fear-related illness while case was pending. The theological justification was elaborate and carefully constructed. The Inquisition didn't kill people. It handed them over to secular authorities for punishment. This legal fiction allowed church officials to maintain they weren't violating the "thou shalt not kill" commandment. The church investigated, tried, and convicted. That the state always executed exactly who the church said to execute was considered irrelevant to the church's moral cleanliness. The burning itself was justified through scripture interpretation. Heresy was spiritual cancer. It infected souls and spread through communities. Removing it through fire was purification. The physical body died, but the soul, through suffering, might still achieve salvation at the final moment. Every priest at every auto da fe emphasized this. We burn the body to save the soul. Whether the condemned found this logic persuasive while they were on fire was not recorded. The wheel is approximately 6 feet in diameter, made from oak or elm, with thick spokes radiating from an iron hub. It's mounted on a heavy wooden post, driven into the ground so the wheel can rotate freely. The rim is wide, 8 or 10 inches, wide enough to support a human body. The prisoner is brought to the wheel and forced to lie across it face up, their back against the rim, limbs spread toward the spokes. Their wrists and ankles are tied to the spokes with rope, not tight enough to cut circulation that would cause unconsciousness, which would defeat the purpose. Tight enough that they can't move, can't protect themselves, can't do anything but wait for what comes next. The executioner holds an iron bar. It's approximately 4 feet long, 2 inches in diameter, heavy enough to break bone, but not so heavy it can't be controlled precisely. This is a tool that requires skill. The executioner is experienced. He knows exactly where to strike and how hard. The breaking begins with the limbs working from extremities inward. The executioner raises the bar and brings it down on the prisoner's left shin, just below the knee. The impact shatters the tibia and fibula. The sound is distinct, a crack that carries across the plaza because breaking wheels were public events, performed in open squares where crowds gathered to watch. The prisoner screams. The executioner waits, not for mercy, for the scream to subside enough that the inquisitor or presiding official can ask questions. Do you confess? Will you recant? The prisoner is given opportunity between each blow to end this by saying the correct words. Most don't confess, not at the first blow. So the process continues. Right shin, left thigh, right thigh. Each blow delivered with precision to break bone without causing immediate death. The femur requires more force than the lower leg. The executioner adjusts his grip, his stance, his swing. This is craftsmanship. Then the arms. Left forearm, right forearm, the radius and ulna snap more easily than leg bones. Then the upper arms. The humerus requires force similar to the femur. The prisoner is screaming continuously now or has gone silent from shock. Both responses are acceptable. The ribs come next. This is where the executioner must be most careful. The ribs protect vital organs. Strike too hard or in the wrong location and you cause internal hemorrhaging that kills quickly. Strike correctly and you break ribs without puncturing lungs or heart. The prisoner lives. The suffering continues. By this point, 8, 10, 12 blows, every major bone in the limbs is fractured. The prisoner's arms and legs are no longer rigid. They hang limp, held in position only by the ropes tying them to spokes. The bones inside have been reduced to fragments. Now comes the braiding. The executioner, or an assistant, unties the ropes and begins weaving the broken limbs through the spokes of the wheel. Because the bones are shattered, the limbs are flexible in ways intact limbs are not. An arm can be threaded over and under spokes like rope through a loom. A leg can be bent backward, forward, wrapped around the rim. The prisoner is still alive, still conscious, or drifting in and out. The braiding isn't just spectacle, it's positioning for the final stage. Once the limbs are woven through the spokes, the prisoner's broken body is displayed. The wheel is sometimes raised on its post, elevated so crowds can see clearly. Or it's left to rotate slowly in the wind, the broken figure turning like some grotesque religious icon. Exhibition could last hours or days. The prisoner was left on the wheel to die of exposure, dehydration, internal injuries, or shock. Death was not quick. The breaking itself rarely caused fatal damage. That was the point. The prisoner had to survive the breaking so they could endure the dying. Coup de grace practices varied by region and by the prisoner's cooperation. If the prisoner confessed during the breaking, they might receive a mercy blow, a strike to the chest or head that caused immediate death. If they maintained silence or refused to confess, no mercy blow was given. They were left to die slowly. In some regions, the coup de grace was delivered after 2 hours. In others, after 6. In some, never. The inquisitor or local authority decided based on the severity of the heresy and the completeness of the confession. Regional variations were significant. In Catalonia, the wheel was used more frequently than in Castile. In some areas, the breaking was done with the prisoner lying on the ground instead of across the wheel. Then the body was moved to the wheel for display afterward. In others, the wheel itself was used as the breaking surface, each blow driving broken bone against the hard oak rim. Timeline from breaking to death. Minimum 2 hours if major blood vessels were damaged. Maximum 3 days if the prisoner was young, healthy, and unlucky. Most died within 12 to 24 hours from a combination of shock, internal bleeding, and exposure. The theological justification was similar to other Inquisition methods. The body must suffer so the soul can be purified. But the wheel had additional symbolic meaning. The circular shape represented eternity, the endless nature of God's judgment. The spokes represented the paths of righteousness from which the heretic had strayed. Breaking the body on the wheel was physical manifestation of spiritual truth. Whether this symbolism provided comfort to the person being broken was not a question the Inquisition considered important. The breaking wheel was used less frequently than the rack or strappado, but it left deeper psychological marks on communities. People might not witness a torture chamber session, but they couldn't avoid seeing the wheel in the public square. They walked past it daily. They saw bodies displayed. They heard the screams during breaking. They watched the slow dying. It was advertising. It was warning. It was the Inquisition's way of ensuring everyone understood that resistance had consequences that extended beyond death. There's significant historical debate about whether the Iron Maiden was actually used by the Spanish Inquisition, or whether it's largely a myth propagated by 19th century writers who romanticized medieval torture. The truth sits somewhere in the middle, uncomfortable and complicated. The classic Iron Maiden, a human-shaped cabinet lined with interior spikes that impale the victim when the door closes, probably didn't exist in the form most people imagine. The famous examples in museums, like the one in Nuremberg, were constructed in the 1800s for exhibition purposes. They're artifacts of Victorian fascination with medieval cruelty, not actual historical instruments. But spike-lined cabinets did exist in Spain during the Inquisition period. They just weren't quite as theatrical as the legend suggests. The documented devices were smaller than the standing sarcophagus shape popular in illustrations, more like closets or wooden boxes reinforced with iron bands. The interior was fitted with iron spikes, but not densely packed. The spikes were positioned strategically, at chest level, at thigh level, at shoulder height. Long enough to penetrate flesh when the door closed, but not long enough to reach vital organs immediately. The prisoner was forced into the cabinet standing or sometimes seated depending on the design. The door closed slowly. The spikes made contact with skin. Then pressure increased. The spikes penetrated, half an inch, 2 inches. Not deep enough to cause rapid death. Deep enough to cause extraordinary pain and bleeding. The door didn't close completely in most cases. It was held partially open by the spikes already embedded in flesh. The prisoner couldn't collapse because the spikes held them upright. Couldn't move because any movement caused the spikes to tear through tissue in new directions. They stood or sat impaled on multiple points, blood running down their body, and waited. Sessions lasted hours. The design prevented the prisoner from losing consciousness easily because the pain was distributed across multiple wounds, rather than concentrated in one area. The body's shock response to injury is triggered most effectively by single catastrophic trauma. Multiple smaller traumas, even if they add up to the same total damage, keep the victim conscious longer. Blood loss was significant, but rarely immediately fatal. The spikes created puncture wounds that bled steadily but didn't sever major arteries. A person can lose 30–40% of their blood volume before dying, and that process takes time. The prisoner bled, weakened, and remained aware of their situation for hours. Infection was the ultimate killer for those who survived the session. The spikes weren't cleaned between uses. They accumulated blood, tissue, bacteria from previous prisoners. Every new victim was exposed to whatever pathogens the previous victims had carried. Sepsis developed within days. Fevers, delirium, organ failure. Death came roughly a week after the torture in many documented cases. Similar devices confirmed in Spain include the Virgin of Nuremberg-style cabinet found in Zaragoza, though its authenticity is disputed. More reliably documented are spiked interrogation chairs, seats fitted with spikes on the sitting surface and back, arms fitted with clamps. Not quite the Iron Maiden of legend, but similar in principle. The prisoner sat on spikes while being questioned. Couldn't stand. Couldn't relieve pressure. The spikes penetrated slowly as body weight and fatigue caused them to sink deeper into the chair. The psychological impact before physical torture was immense. The device was shown to prisoners as a threat. The mere sight of it, a human-shaped cabinet with spikes visible through the partially open door, was often enough to produce confession. The imagination filled in details worse than reality. What would it feel like to be sealed inside that? How long would it take to die? Would death come quickly or slowly? The Inquisition understood that anticipated pain could be as effective as actual pain. Showing the instruments, describing their use, watching the prisoner's face as they understood what was coming. This was part of the process. The torture began in the mind before it touched the body. Museum pieces versus authentic artifacts is a genuine problem for historians. Many Iron Maidens in European museums were constructed in the 1800s, during a period of Gothic revival and fascination with medieval horror. These weren't forgeries in the criminal sense. They were educational reconstructions based on descriptions in historical texts. But over time, the reconstructions became confused with authentic artifacts. Actual devices from the Inquisition period are rare. Wood rots. Iron corrodes. And when the Inquisition was finally abolished in 1834, many instruments were deliberately destroyed by officials embarrassed by the institution's history. What remains are fragments, descriptions in Inquisition records, and later reconstructions of varying historical accuracy. The Iron Maiden became legendary precisely because it embodied efficient cruelty. It required no operator constantly present. Once the prisoner was sealed inside, the device did its work automatically. The inquisitor could leave, attend to other business, return hours later to find the prisoner weakened by blood loss and ready to confess. It was torture that didn't require continuous human participation, which made it bureaucratically efficient. Whether the Spanish Inquisition actually used Iron Maidens in significant numbers remains uncertain. What's certain is that they used spike-line devices of various designs. They used enclosures that prevented movement and caused pain through contact with sharp points. Whether the specific configuration matches the Victorian Iron Maiden or not is almost academic. The principle was the same. The suffering was real. And the legend of the Iron Maiden, even if partly mythological, served the Inquisition's purposes. Fear of torture is most effective when it's slightly mysterious, when people aren't quite sure what the device does, but they know it's terrible. The Iron Maiden legend grew because it captured something essential about the Inquisition, the methodical, patient, bureaucratized approach to destroying human bodies in the name of saving souls. The device is small, almost innocuous-looking when you first see it, roughly the size and shape of a pear, made from iron or brass, constructed in segments that can expand. At the narrow end is a screw mechanism. At the wide end are 3 or 4 metal pedals that fold closed when the device is compressed and spring open when the screw is turned. There are 3 primary variants, each designed for insertion into a different body orifice: the oral pair for the mouth, the rectal pair for the anus, the vaginal pair for women. The variants differ slightly in size and in the degree of expansion they're capable of, but the operating principle is identical. The prisoner is restrained, on a table in a chair held by multiple guards. The pair is inserted into the chosen orifice in its closed position. Then the screw mechanism at the base is turned slowly. With each rotation, the pedals at the top expand outward. 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, an inch. The expansion continues until the device reaches its maximum aperture, or until the prisoner's body can't accommodate further expansion. The mouth version was used for prisoners accused of heresy through speech, spreading false doctrine, blaspheming, speaking against church authority. The pair was inserted with the screw mechanism outside the lips. As it expanded, the pedals forced the jaw open beyond its normal range. The temporomandibular joint, where the jaw connects to the skull, was stressed past its limit. The joint could dislocate. The ligaments that hold it in place could tear. The pressure on teeth could crack them or tear them from their sockets. Prisoners couldn't speak with the device in their mouth, couldn't swallow. Saliva accumulated in the throat, causing choking. Many vomited around the device, aspirating stomach contents into their lungs. The expansion could last minutes or hours, depending on the interrogator's patience and the prisoner's resistance. The rectal pair was used for male prisoners accused of sodomy or for any prisoner the inquisitor wanted to particularly degrade. Insertion was agonizing even before expansion began. The anal sphincter isn't designed to accommodate objects of that size. Forced insertion caused tearing. Then expansion began. The internal damage was catastrophic. The rectum has relatively little capacity for expansion. The pair's pedals, opening outward, tore through the rectal wall. Internal bleeding was common. Perforation of the intestinal tract caused infection that was universally fatal in the pre-antibiotic era. The vaginal pair was used on women accused of sexual sins, adultery, prostitution, witchcraft involving sexual congress with demons. The physical damage was similar to the rectal variant. The vaginal canal can accommodate childbirth, but not rigid metal pedals expanding in multiple directions simultaneously. Tearing of the vaginal wall, damage to the cervix. In severe cases, perforation through to the bladder or rectum. The expansion mechanism varied by device. Some screws allowed continuous expansion. Turn the screw and the pedals opened smoothly. Others had a ratchet mechanism that locked at intervals, preventing the pedals from closing again even if the screw was reversed. The prisoner had to endure whatever degree of expansion had been achieved until the inquisitor decided to remove the device. Different sizes existed for different crimes, a small pair for minor offenses, larger for more serious charges. The inquisitor selected the size based on the nature of the heresy and the information desired from the prisoner. Everything was calibrated, categorized, documented. Internal tearing and rupturing was the immediate physical effect, but the long-term damage was equally severe. Scar tissue formation, chronic pain, loss of continence, fistulas, abnormal connections between organs caused by perforation. A woman with a vaginal rectal fistula caused by the pair would live with feces passing through her vagina, for the rest of her life. There was no surgical correction available. The condition was permanent. Infection from internal wounds caused by the pair had mortality rates approaching 100% in serious cases. The devices weren't sterilized. The internal cavities of the human body are warm, moist environments perfect for bacterial growth. Wounds caused by the pair became infected within hours. Fever, sepsis, organ failure followed within days. Gender-specific applications reflected the Inquisition's particular obsession with sexual sin. Women were tortured with the pair more frequently than men, and the vaginal variant was used even for offenses unrelated to sexuality. A woman accused of heretical beliefs might receive the vaginal pair simply because she was a woman, and that was the torture deemed appropriate for female heretics. The humiliation was part of the design. The Inquisition understood that shame could break resistance as effectively as pain. Forcing a woman to submit to vaginal penetration with a device operated by male inquisitors in front of male guards, and a male notary documenting everything. This was violation beyond the physical. It was psychological destruction through sexualized violence. Records from the Barcelona Tribunal 1530s describe a woman named Francesca subjected to the vaginal pair for refusing to confess to Congress with the devil. The notation states the device was expanded to the third increment, and she confessed with great cries and lamentation. She named 3 other women who she claimed attended nocturnal gatherings. All 3 were arrested. 1 confessed under threat of torture. 1 was tortured with the pair and confessed. 1 maintained innocence and was burned. Francesca was reconciled, but the record notes she suffered corruption of the flesh afterward and died before serving her sentence. Another case from Seville, 1485, involves a man named Diego accused of sodomy. He was subjected to the rectal pair, expanded to the 4th increment, which was noted as the maximum extension of the device. He confessed immediately to sodomy and named his partner, who was arrested and also tortured. Both were burned at the stake. The record includes a notation that Diego could not control his bowels from the time of torture until the time of execution, and required special handling to keep him clean enough for the auto da fe. The irreversible internal damage meant that even prisoners who survived and were reconciled carried permanent evidence of their torture. A woman who couldn't control her bladder, a man who couldn't control his bowels. These weren't just medical conditions. They were social markers. Everyone in the community knew what those symptoms meant. They indicated the person had been tortured by the Inquisition. The physical damage became a permanent badge of shame. The pair of anguish represents the Inquisition's willingness to target the most private, most vulnerable parts of the human body. It wasn't enough to break bones or tear muscles. They needed to violate sexual organs, to destroy the parts of the body associated with intimacy and identity. The pair made suffering personal in a way that the rack or strapado didn't. And like all Inquisition tortures, it was legal, approved, documented. Physicians were present to ensure the expansion didn't immediately kill the prisoner. Notaries recorded the increment of expansion, the duration of application, the prisoner's responses. The bureaucracy transformed sexual violation into procedural routine. The prisoner is strapped to a wooden trestle, an angled board with restraints for wrists, ankles, and torso. The head is positioned lower than the feet, creating a downward slope that ensures water will flow toward the face and into the airway. This positioning isn't accidental. It's essential to the method's effectiveness. Sharp cords, called cordellis, are wound tightly around the limbs before the water begins. These serve dual purposes. They restrain the prisoner, preventing the violent thrashing that occurs during simulated drowning. And they cause additional pain. The cords bite into flesh, cutting circulation, creating pressure points that hurt more as time progresses, and muscles swell from restricted blood flow. A thin cloth is forced into the prisoner's mouth, not just placed on the tongue, pushed deep, far enough back that gagging is triggered. Then additional cloth is spread across the face, covering mouth and nose completely. The cloth used is specific, loose weave linen that absorbs water readily but allows some airflow when dry. When wet, it becomes an impermeable barrier. Water is poured slowly onto the cloth from a clay jar, or sometimes a leather skin. The person doing the pouring is experienced. Too fast and the prisoner drowns. Too slow, and the effect is diminished. The correct rate is approximately 1 cup every 20 to 30 seconds. Steady, measured, relentless. The cloth absorbs the water, and the weight of the saturated fabric pushes the mouthcloth deeper into the throat. Water fills the mouth. The prisoner tries to breathe through their nose, but the cloth covering the nostrils is soaked, impermeable. No air enters, only water. The sensation is drowning, not reminiscent of drowning. It is the experience of drowning, complete and total. The body triggers its drowning reflex, the primitive involuntary panic response that fires when the brain detects water in the airway. This reflex is hardwired. It cannot be controlled through willpower or training. When water enters the airway, the body responds with overwhelming terror and violent attempts to escape. The lungs heave, the diaphragm spasms. The chest contracts violently, trying to expel water that continues to pour. The prisoner experiences absolute certainty that they're dying, that death is seconds away, that the next failed breath will be their last. Time distorts. Seconds feel like minutes. The primitive brain, flooded with panic signals, loses track of everything except the desperate need for air. Then the cloth is removed. The prisoner gasps, chokes, vomits water. They cough so violently that blood vessels burst in their eyes and face, creating red blotches across their skin. They heave and gag, trying to clear their airway of water and stomach contents. This lasts 30 seconds, maybe a minute, just long enough to pull 1 or 2 full breaths. Then the cloth is replaced and the water begins again. This is the toca. This is waterboarding. And the Inquisition practiced it for 350 years before it became controversial in modern contexts. Up to 8 quarts of water could be poured during a single session. That's 2 gallons. The prisoner's stomach distended from swallowed water. Their lungs held water that had been aspirated during the failed breathing attempts. Some prisoners vomited so violently and frequently that stomach acid burned their throats and nasal passages, causing damage that lasted weeks. The combination with other restraints made the toca worse. The cordellas around the limbs meant the prisoner couldn't even thrash effectively. They were held completely still while experiencing the terror of drowning. No movement to dissipate the panic. No physical action that might create even an illusion of control. Just absolute helplessness. The psychological breakdown timeline was remarkably consistent. First application, shock and panic. Second application, desperate attempts to hold breath, failing within 30-40 seconds. Third application, complete loss of control, animal panic, psychological defenses beginning to collapse. Fourth through sixth applications, pleading, bargaining, offering partial confessions. Seventh application and beyond, total breakdown, willingness to confess to anything. Most prisoners confessed before reaching the 8th application. Not because the physical damage was unbearable, though it certainly was, but because the psychological experience of repeated drowning broke something fundamental in the mind's ability to resist. The toca didn't just cause pain. It caused existential terror. It made the prisoner experience their own death over and over without actually dying. Some lost consciousness. The body has a protective mechanism where, if oxygen deprivation becomes severe enough, consciousness cuts out. But the torturers were experienced. They recognized the signs of approaching unconsciousness and stopped before it occurred. A cloth removed at the right moment. A brief respite, then resumption. Some suffered permanent lung damage from water aspiration. The inhaled water caused pneumonia, lung infections, chronic breathing difficulties. Months after torture, survivors would still cough up blood and struggle with respiratory problems. The modern parallels are direct and explicit. Waterboarding, as practiced in the 2000s during the War on Terror, is essentially identical to the toca. Same positioning, same pouring of water, same psychological and physical effects. The methods described in CIA documents match the procedures documented in Inquisition records from 500 years earlier. The medical effects documented in both eras are similar. Extreme panic response, vomiting, aspiration pneumonia, psychological trauma that persists long after the physical torture ends, PTSD symptoms, anxiety, panic attacks triggered by water or wet sensations on the face. The controversies are similar too. Is waterboarding torture? The Inquisition said no. It leaves no permanent visible marks, causes no broken bones, sheds no blood. Therefore, it's moderate torture, acceptable under ecclesiastical law. Modern defenders used nearly identical logic. It's an enhanced interrogation technique, not torture, because it doesn't cause lasting physical damage. Both arguments ignore the psychological damage, which is severe and permanent. Both ignore the medical complications. Both ignore the fundamental reality that causing someone to experience drowning repeatedly is torture regardless of whether they actually drown. Historian Edward Peters documented that the toca was the most commonly used Inquisition torture method. More common than the rack, more common than the strappado. Why? Because it was effective, left minimal visible evidence, and could be applied repeatedly in short sessions without causing the kind of obvious mutilation that might create political problems. One documented case from Toledo, 1590s. A merchant named Alonso, accused of Protestant sympathies. First session, 6 applications of the toca, no confession. Second session, 8 applications, partial confession. Third session, 4 applications, full confession, including names of 11 others. Total time across 3 sessions, approximately 2 hours. Total physical damage, aspiration pneumonia that lasted 3 weeks. Total psychological damage. According to a priest who visited him later in prison, he cannot bear to see water poured and trembles at the sound of rain. Another case from Cordoba, 1520. A woman named Isabel, accused of teaching her children Jewish prayers. First session, 5 applications, no confession. Second session, 7 applications, she confessed but named no one. Third session, 9 applications, she named her mother, her sister, and 2 neighbors. All were arrested. Her mother was burned at the stake. Isabel was reconciled, but the record notes she fell into fits when brought near water. Thereafter, the toca represents the Inquisition's understanding that breaking the mind can be more effective than breaking the body. Physical pain has limits. The body goes into shock, consciousness fades, pain receptors become overwhelmed. But psychological terror, especially the terror of imminent death, can be repeated indefinitely because each application feels like the first time. The mind doesn't adapt to the sensation of drowning the way it might adapt to other pain. Every application is equally terrifying, and the toca was considered humane by Inquisition standards. It was ordinary torture, the baseline, the thing they did before escalating to more severe methods. The fact that simulated drowning was routine, that it was documented in notary records with the same bureaucratic precision as property inventories, that it was applied to thousands of people over centuries, tells you everything you need to know about the institution that practiced it. The device looks deceptively simple, a metal handle attached to multiple iron prongs that curve like claws. 3, 4, or 5 prongs depending on the variant, each one approximately 3 to 4 inches long, sharpened to points at the tips. The name tickler is grotesquely ironic. There's nothing gentle about what this device does. The prisoner is restrained, arms bound overhead and pulled taut, torso exposed, or bound to a table face up or face down, depending on which body area the inquisitor wants accessed. The Spanish tickler is versatile. It can be applied to virtually any part of the body. But certain areas are preferred. The torturer grips the handle and presses the prongs against skin. Not deeply at first, just contact. Then pressure increases. The sharpened prongs penetrate, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. They're positioned in a curved pattern so they enter flesh at slightly different angles. Then the torturer pulls. The flesh-tearing technique is exactly what it sounds like. The prongs hook into tissue, skin, fat, muscle, and drag backward. The resistance of tissue gripping the prongs creates tension. Then the tissue tears. The sound is wet and terrible. The pain is immediate and catastrophic because the prongs don't make clean cuts. They tear ragged channels through flesh, shredding tissue rather than slicing it. A single stroke with the Spanish tickler can remove strips of skin 6 inches long and 2 inches wide. The prongs dig deep enough to reach muscle, sometimes to bone. The prisoner watches their own flesh being peeled away in strips, watches blood sheet down their body, watches the torturer wipe the prongs clean and position for the next stroke. Use on breasts was common for female prisoners. The prongs were hooked into breast tissue and pulled, tearing away flesh and exposing the underlying muscle and ribs. Damage to the breast was particularly devastating not just because of the pain, but because of the social and psychological impact. A woman with breasts torn and scarred was marked permanently. Breastfeeding became impossible. The visible disfigurement marked her as torture victim forever. Use on limbs, arms, legs, thighs, calves, was standard for both male and female prisoners. The larger muscle groups provided more tissue to tear. Multiple passes with the tickler could strip muscle down to bone. Some prisoners lost functional use of limbs not because bones were broken, but because the muscles that moved those bones were torn away. Use on the face was reserved for specific accusations, particularly crimes of speech or expression. A prisoner accused of blasphemy might have the tickler applied to their face, tearing away lips, cheeks, nose. The disfigurement was intentional. They wanted the prisoner to carry visible evidence of their sin even after the torture ended. Infection and blood loss complications were universal. Every stroke of the Spanish tickler created multiple open wounds. The prongs weren't sterile. They carried bacteria from previous victims. The ragged nature of the wounds meant they didn't close easily. Blood loss was significant but rarely immediately fatal unless a major vessel was torn. More commonly, prisoners bled steadily for hours, weakening them to the point where shock and infection could finish what the torture started. Scarring and disfigurement were permanent. The ragged wounds healed with thick, ropey scar tissue that contracted as it formed, distorting the shape of the affected body part. A prisoner with the tickler applied to their back might heal with their spine pulled into an abnormal curve. A prisoner with facial wounds might heal unable to fully close their mouth or move their jaw normally. Heated metal variants existed. The Spanish tickler could be heated in a brazier until red hot before application. The prongs cauterized as they tore searing flesh even as they shredded it. The smell of burning meat filled the chamber. The pain combined tearing and burning simultaneously, and the heated prongs caused deeper tissue damage, killing nerves and creating wounds that often turned gangrenous despite the cauterization. Removal of muscle tissue wasn't just collateral damage. It was sometimes the goal. For prisoners accused of using their bodies in sinful ways, the Inquisition would deliberately destroy the relevant body parts. A dancer accused of using her performances to tempt men to sin might have the muscles of her legs systematically torn away. A laborer accused of working on holy days might have his arm muscles stripped. The torture was designed to fit the crime in a grotesque parody of justice. Victim testimony excerpts are rare because most prisoners subjected to the Spanish tickler either died from complications or survived so damaged they couldn't speak coherently about what happened. But fragments exist. From Barcelona, 1512, a woman named Marta testified in a property dispute years after being tortured. She described the tickler as iron claws that tore my flesh as though I were a beast being skinned. She said the inquisitor asked her questions between each stroke, but I could not answer because I was screaming and choking on my own blood, she confessed after the fourth stroke. Her back, she testified, remained forever marked with channels where the flesh had been torn away, such that I could not lie on my back without pain for the rest of my days. From Seville, 1490, a man named Rodrigo described in a deposition how the tickler was applied to his thighs. They hooked the iron into my legs and pulled until I saw my own muscle exposed white against the blood. I confessed to practices I had never performed, and named men I had never met because I would have confessed to anything, to being the devil himself, if it would make them stop. The Spanish tickler wasn't used as frequently as the rack or the toca, but it left a deeper psychological mark on communities, because the results were visible. A prisoner emerged from the torture chamber with the effects of the rack, might walk strangely, might have limited arm movement. But a prisoner who'd experienced the Spanish tickler carried their torture on their skin. Deep scars, missing chunks of flesh, disfigurement that couldn't be hidden. This visibility served the Inquisition's purposes. The tortured became walking advertisements for what resistance cost. Every person who saw them was reminded that the Holy Office had power not just to punish, but to permanently mark, to transform a human body into evidence of institutional authority. The Spanish tickler is displayed in museums now, behind glass, with small placards explaining its historical use. It looks almost harmless in that context. Just a piece of worked metal, corroded with age, the prongs no longer sharp. But when you understand what it was designed to do, when you imagine the torturer's grip on that handle and the prisoner's flesh tearing away, when you remember that this was done by educated men who documented their work and went home to their families afterward, the device stops being a historical curiosity and becomes evidence of what humans are capable of doing to each other when given permission and institutional support. The device resembles a vise, two flat metal or wooden plates connected by a threaded screw mechanism. The plates are approximately 6 inches by 8 inches, large enough to encompass a human knee or elbow joint. The surfaces that face each other are often studded with small pyramidal spikes, though smooth plates were also common. The screw mechanism is robust, designed to generate enormous compressive force. The prisoner is restrained in a seated or reclined position. The knee splitter is positioned around the knee joint. The leg is bent at approximately 90 degrees, the optimal angle for the device to engage both the kneecap and the joint structures beneath it. The plates are placed on either side, one above the kneecap, one below. Then the screw is tightened. The first few turns create pressure. The plates press against flesh, compress muscle. The prisoner feels increasing discomfort, but not yet pain. This is the warning phase. The Inquisitor asks questions. This is your opportunity to confess. Save yourself this suffering. The prisoner denies the charges or refuses to name accomplices. The screw turns again. The kneecap, the patella, is a small bone shaped like a shield that protects the knee joint. It's not designed to withstand compressive force from the front and back simultaneously. As the plates tighten, the patella is squeezed. The bone begins to deform slightly. The cartilage beneath it, which cushions the patella against the femur, compresses beyond its normal range. The pain intensifies rapidly. The knee joint is dense with nerve endings. It has to be, because the knee needs constant feedback about position and stress to function properly. But this sensitivity, which serves the body well during normal movement, becomes a liability under torture. Every fraction of an inch the screw advances creates exponentially more pain, more turns. The patella cracks, not completely fracturing, not yet, but developing stress fractures that web across the surface of the bone. The prisoner hears it, a series of small cracking sounds coming from inside their own knee. Feels it too, a sick wrongness that's different from muscle pain or skin pain. This is bone damage. This is structural failure of the skeleton. The progressive tightening continues if the prisoner doesn't confess. The plates compress the joint to the point where the patella fractures into multiple pieces. The fragments, no longer held in proper position, shift under continued pressure. Sharp bone edges cut into surrounding muscle and tendon. The prisoner's leg is being destroyed from the inside out. But the knee splitter doesn't stop at the kneecap. The compression continues into the joint itself. The femur, the thigh bone, and the tibia, the shin bone, meet at the knee joint. Between them is a complex structure of ligaments and cartilage, the ACL, PCL, meniscus, all the components that allow the knee to bend and bear weight. Under extreme compression, these structures rupture. The ligaments tear. The meniscus, a crescent-shaped pad of cartilage, crushes and fragments. The synovial fluid that lubricates the joint is forced out. Eventually, the bones themselves come into direct contact, grinding against each other, and the compression continues until the bones crack. The sound of a knee being crushed is distinct, multiple components failing simultaneously. Bone fragmenting, cartilage pulping, ligaments snapping. Witnesses in the torture chamber reported that the sound was worse than the screaming. The screaming was human, comprehensible, expected. The grinding and cracking was alien, mechanical, the sound of a body being reduced to broken components. Bone crushing and splintering occurred in stages. First the patella, then the condyles, the rounded prominences at the end of the femur that articulate with the tibia. Then the tibial plateau, the flat top of the shin bone. Each structure had its own breaking point. Each failure was documented in the notary's record. When the knee splitter was applied to the elbow joint, the mechanics were similar, but the anatomy was more complex. The elbow is a hinge joint formed by three bones: humerus, radius, ulna. The olecranon, the pointy bone you feel at the back of your elbow, is particularly vulnerable to crushing. It's essentially a lever for the triceps muscle. Crush it, and the person loses the ability to straighten their arm. Permanent crippling effects were universal for prisoners subjected to the knee splitter. A crushed knee doesn't heal. Medieval medicine couldn't reconstruct shattered joint structures. The best outcome was a fused joint, the bones healing together in whatever position they'd been crushed into, creating a stiff, immobile leg. The worst outcome was a joint that remained fragmented and unstable, causing constant pain and making walking impossible. Most survivors needed crutches or canes for life. Many became completely immobile, unable to walk even with assistance. In an era without wheelchairs, without disability accommodations, without social support systems, this meant absolute dependence on family charity or slow death from starvation and exposure. The non-lethal torture advantage for inquisitors was significant. The knee splitter could destroy a person's ability to walk, to work, to function independently, but it didn't typically cause death. A prisoner could be tortured until they confessed, then released to live out their days as a crippled reminder of what resistance cost. They became walking propaganda, visible evidence of the Inquisition's power. Pain threshold testing was part of the documented procedure. Inquisitors noted at what point the prisoner first cried out, at what point they began pleading, at what point they offered confession, at what point they provided names. This data informed future applications. If experience showed that most prisoners confessed when the knee splitter reached a certain level of compression, that became the standard application. Recovery was impossible for most. Some prisoners regained limited mobility through sheer determination, learning to walk on a leg with a destroyed knee through compensatory movements that damaged their hips and spine over time. Most never walked normally again. The joint remained unstable, painful, prone to re-injury with minimal stress. One case from Valencia, 1501, a man named Benito, accused of Islamic practices, applied the knee splitter to both knees simultaneously. The record states he resisted until the fourth turn of each screw, at which point both knees made sounds of breaking. He confessed and named 7 others. He was reconciled and released. A later record from a civil court case mentions him as Benito the Cripple, who cannot walk without 2 staves and whose legs are bent in unnatural fashion. Another case from Toledo, 1556. A woman named Leonor, accused of Lutheran heresy, applied the knee splitter to her right knee. The record notes she confessed after the 3rd turn but would not name accomplices. The torture continued. At the 6th turn there was great cracking and she screamed most piteously. She provided 6 names. All were arrested. She was reconciled but remained unable to bend the knee thereafter and walked, dragging the leg behind her. The knee splitter exemplifies the Inquisition's approach to calibrated destruction. It didn't kill quickly. It didn't create dramatic spectacle like burning at the stake. It simply, methodically, permanently destroyed a specific body part while leaving the prisoner conscious and aware of exactly what was happening to them. The psychological component was crucial. The prisoner could see the device, could see the screw turning, could watch the plates getting closer, could hear their own bones breaking, and they knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't something that could be endured and then recovered from. This was permanent. This was the rest of their life being destroyed, one turn of the screw at a time. And they could make it stop. All they had to do was say the words the Inquisitor wanted to hear. Confess, name names, abandon whatever belief or practice had brought them to this room. The knee splitter placed the responsibility for the torture on the prisoner. You're doing this to yourself. We're just turning the screw. You could stop us. You choose not to. Therefore, this is your fault. This logic, perverse and cruel as it was standard throughout Inquisition torture. The tortured were blamed for their own suffering. And the knee splitter, with its slow, controllable, reversible progression, embodied this logic perfectly, right up until the point where the bones cracked and the damage became irreversible. Then it was too late. Then the prisoner lived with the consequences for whatever remained of their life. The device is immediately recognizable by its cruel specificity. 4 iron prongs arranged in a claw-like pattern, each one curved inward like a talon. The prongs are approximately 3 inches long, sharpened at the tips, and the base where they meet is fitted with a handle or sometimes a chain for attachment to a wall or post. This isn't a multi-purpose instrument. It was designed for one thing: the mutilation of women's breasts. The prisoner is bound with arms overhead, torso exposed, sometimes restrained against a wall or post, sometimes tied to a table or frame. The positioning must allow access to the chest and must prevent the prisoner from moving away when the device is applied. The breast ripper, cold or heated, is pressed against the breast. The 4 prongs are positioned to surround the nipple and areola, forming a square or diamond pattern. Then pressure is applied. The prongs penetrate skin, penetrate breast tissue, hook into the flesh beneath. The pain is immediate and severe. Breast tissue is highly innervated, dense with nerve endings that make it sensitive to touch under normal circumstances. Under torture, that sensitivity becomes agony. When heated, the device is brought to red-hot temperature in a brazier. The application combines burning and penetration simultaneously. The prongs sear flesh as they pierce it. The smell of burning tissue fills the chamber. The prisoner can see the glowing metal approaching, can feel the heat radiating from it before contact, can do nothing to prevent what's coming. The attachment phase is just preparation. The tearing is what gives the device its name. Once the prongs are embedded, hooked into breast tissue deep enough that they won't pull free easily, the torturer pulls. Sometimes straight outward, away from the chest wall, sometimes at an angle, twisting as well as pulling. The force required is significant because breast tissue, despite being soft, is fibrous and resistant to tearing. It stretches before it tears. The prisoner experiences this stretching as the prongs drag tissue outward, pulling the breast into a grotesque cone shape before the tissue finally gives way. When it tears incompletely. Ragged chunks of flesh rip away but leave portions still attached. The prongs are then repositioned and the process repeats. Pull, tear, reposition, pull. Each application removes more tissue. Some sessions continued until the entire breast was destroyed, reduced to bloody remnants hanging from the chest wall. The punishment was applied for specific accusations: women accused of adultery, women accused of abortion or infanticide, women accused of seducing men away from their marriage vows or their religious duties, women accused of witchcraft involving sexual elements. The Inquisition's logic was transparent. If a woman had used her body to sin, her body would be destroyed. Nursing mothers received this torture more frequently than other women. The accusation would often involve corrupting their children through heretical teachings passed along during breastfeeding. The symbolism was deliberate. The breast that fed heresy to children would be torn away. Scarring and mutilation results were catastrophic and permanent. Even women who survived infection and blood loss were left with massive scar tissue where breasts had been. The chest wall, exposed during the tearing, often became infected despite cauterization from heated prongs. As wounds healed, scar tissue contracted, sometimes so severely that it restricted arm movement or breathing. The mutilation marked women in ways that destroyed their social existence. In 16th century Spain, a woman's ability to marry, to bear children, to function in society, was tied to her body's integrity. A woman with breasts torn away was unmarriageable. If she had been married, her husband could annul the marriage on grounds that she was damaged goods. Her children faced social stigma. Her entire family name was tainted. Bleeding and infection risks were extreme. Breast tissue is highly vascular, dense with blood vessels. Tearing it away caused massive hemorrhaging. Some women bled to death during or immediately after torture. Others survived the session but developed infections in the days following. Sepsis, gangrene, necrotizing fasciitis. The wound surface was large, open to contamination, impossible to keep clean in prison conditions. Infection mortality rates for breast ripper torture are estimated at 4060%, higher than many other methods because of the large wound surface, the vascular nature of the tissue. and the likelihood that heated prongs introduced additional contamination from whatever organic matter had burned onto them during previous use. Social stigmatization afterward was comprehensive. A woman marked as both a tortured heretic and physically mutilated had no place in society. She couldn't work in occupations that required physical presentation. She couldn't participate in religious ceremonies, because reconciled heretics were restricted from taking communion or entering certain church areas. She became a social ghost, visible but excluded from normal community life. Historical accounts from victims are rare because most women subjected to this torture either died or were so damaged they couldn't testify coherently. But fragments exist in Inquisition records and occasionally in civil court proceedings. Zaragoza, 1498. A woman named Catalina, accused of practicing Jewish rituals. She was subjected to the breast ripper after refusing to confess on the rack. The notary recorded, "The instrument was applied cold to the right breast, and tissue was removed in 3 applications. The prisoner confessed to lighting Sabbath candles and teaching her daughter Hebrew prayers. She named 4 other women. All were arrested. Catalina was reconciled, but the record notes she bore the mark of her sin upon her body for the remainder of her days, and lived as a widow, though her husband yet lived, for he would not look upon her." Seville, 1482. A woman named Beatrice, accused of adultery with a converso man. Both were arrested. The man was tortured on the rack. Beatrice received the breast ripper. The record states the device was heated until it glowed and applied 4 times to both breasts. She confessed and implicated the man, who was burned at the stake for the dual crimes of adultery and secretly practicing Judaism. Beatrice was reconciled. A later record from a charity organization mentions her as one of the unfortunate women who beg alms at the church steps, she being disfigured and unable to work. The breast ripper exists in museums now, usually displayed with minimal description. Torture device, 16th century Spanish Inquisition, used on female prisoners. The clinical language obscures what the device actually did. It doesn't convey the screaming, the blood, the smell of burned flesh, the women who died slowly from infection, the women who survived but lived as outcasts marked permanently by their torture. And it doesn't convey the deliberate gendered nature of the violence. The Spanish Inquisition had torture methods that could be applied to anyone. The rack, the strappado, the water torture. But it also had methods designed specifically to destroy women's bodies, in ways that reflected the Inquisition's particular obsession with female sexuality and reproduction. The breast ripper, the vaginal pear, methods that targeted the parts of women's bodies that made them women. This wasn't accidental. This was institutional policy. The Inquisition believed that women were more susceptible to heresy because they were morally weaker, more easily tempted by the devil, more likely to use their sexuality for evil purposes. Therefore, women's bodies required specific types of correction that targeted their specifically female characteristics. The breast ripper was that correction made manifest in iron and fire. The chair is made of iron. The seat is a metal plate approximately 1 foot square. The back is slightly angled, also iron. Both surfaces, the seat and the back, are studded with iron spikes. The spikes are pyramidal, approximately 1 inch tall, arranged in a grid pattern with roughly 2 inches between each spike. Some versions have spikes on the armrests as well. The entire apparatus is bolted to the floor so it cannot tip or slide. The prisoner is brought to the chair naked or stripped to undergarments. Clothing would provide padding, however minimal, and padding interferes with the intended function. They're forced to sit. The spikes on the seat penetrate the buttocks and backs of the thighs. The spikes on the back penetrate the shoulder blades, the spine, the lower back. Not deeply, maybe half an inch, but enough to cause pain and hold the prisoner in position. Then the restraints are applied. Iron straps or chains across the chest, across the thighs, across the ankles. The straps are tightened, forcing the prisoner harder onto the spikes. The spikes penetrate deeper. 3/4 of an inch. An inch. The prisoner can't shift position to relieve pressure because the straps hold them immobile. Clamps are sometimes added. Metal clamps attached to the chair's frame that grip wrists, ankles, sometimes the neck. The clamps prevent even minimal movement. The prisoner sits perfectly still, impaled on dozens of spikes, unable to move, unable to do anything but experience the accumulating pain. Hours-long sessions were standard. The Spanish chair wasn't used for brief questioning. It was designed for extended interrogation where the pain built slowly over time. The first 10 minutes were excruciating. After an hour, the prisoner's weight pressing continuously on the same penetration points caused the wounds to deepen, to bleed more freely. After 2 hours, muscle fatigue from holding the forced position added to the spike pain. After 3 hours, many prisoners were delirious. But the basic chair, as terrible as it was, could be enhanced. A brazier could be positioned underneath the seat, a metal bowl filled with hot coals, placed directly beneath the iron seat plate. The heat conducted through the metal, heating the entire sitting surface. The prisoner's buttocks and thighs, already impaled on spikes, were now being slowly roasted. The combination of puncture wounds and burns created layered suffering. The spikes caused sharp, localized pain. The heat caused diffuse burning pain that increased as the metal grew hotter. And the two types of pain interfered with the mind's ability to process either one. The result was sensory overload, a confusion of signals that the brain struggled to interpret. The brazier edition meant sessions couldn't last as long because severe burns would cause shock and death. But shorter sessions with the brazier were often more effective than longer sessions without it. The psychological impact of feeling your flesh cooking while spikes held you in place broke resistance faster than spikes alone. Puncture wounds and burns combination also increased infection risk dramatically. Burned tissue is more susceptible to infection than intact tissue. Puncture wounds provide direct pathways for bacteria into deeper tissue layers. Together, they created ideal conditions for sepsis. Many prisoners who survived the chair itself died within a week from infection complications. The psychological pressure during questioning was intense and multi-layered. The inquisitor would ask questions while the prisoner sat on the chair. Standard interrogation. Who do you know who practices heresy? Where do you gather? What rituals do you perform? But the prisoner's ability to think clearly, to formulate responses, to maintain consistent lies degraded rapidly under the physical suffering. Every minute on the chair made coherent thought more difficult. Pain flooded the nervous system. Muscle fatigue clouded judgment. Fear of what came next if they didn't confess, warred with fear of what would happen to the people they named if they did confess. And the inquisitor's voice, calm and patient, asking the same questions over and over, wearing down resistance through sheer persistence. Variations in spike length and density affected the chair's severity. Some chairs had spikes only an inch tall, painful but not deeply penetrating. Others had spikes 2 or even 3 inches tall that could reach muscle, and, in thin prisoners, could penetrate deep enough to scrape bone. Spike density varied too. Closely spaced spikes meant more penetration points, more wounds, more pain. Widely spaced spikes meant each spike bore more weight, penetrated deeper. The Inquisition had different severity chairs for different categories of prisoners. Minor accusations might get the chair with shorter, more widely spaced spikes. Serious accusations got the chair with longer, densely packed spikes, plus the brazier underneath. Confession rates with this method were extremely high. Historical records suggest 70–80% of prisoners subjected to the Spanish chair confessed within the first session. The remaining 20–30% typically confessed during a second session. Almost no one resisted beyond 2 sessions. The combination of continuous pain, inability to move, psychological pressure, and the knowledge that it could get worse at any moment broke resistance efficiently. One documented case from Barcelona, 1520. A merchant named Joan accused of trading with known Protestants. First session on the chair. 2 hours. No brazier. He admitted to trading relationships, but denied knowledge of their religious beliefs. Second session. 3 hours with brazier for the final hour. He confessed to knowingly trading with heretics and provided names of 7 trading partners. All 7 were investigated. 3 were arrested and tortured. Joan was reconciled and released, but a later record notes he walked with difficulty and could not sit comfortably for the remainder of his life. Another case from Valencia, 1502. A woman named Maria, accused of attending secret Islamic prayer services. First session, 90 minutes, no brazier. She denied everything. Second session, 2 hours with brazier for the entire duration. The record states she confessed after 1 hour and named 11 others. She was reconciled. The record notes she bore scars on her back and thighs in the pattern of the chair's spikes, and that these scars suppurated for many weeks after torture. The Spanish chair represents the Inquisition's understanding that you don't need to break bones or tear flesh to destroy someone's will. Sometimes the most effective torture is the kind that causes continuous, unrelenting, inescapable discomfort that builds over time. The chair didn't create dramatic moments of peak pain, like the drop from a strapado or the crushing of a knee splitter. It created hours of moderate to severe pain that never stopped, never decreased, never allowed the mind even a moment's respite. And because the damage was relatively controlled, puncture wounds that bled but didn't hemorrhage, burns that hurt but didn't immediately kill, the chair could be used repeatedly on the same prisoner if initial sessions didn't produce the desired confession. The rack might. 15. The wooden horse. The device is a wooden beam shaped like a triangular prism, like the peaked roof of a house. It's approximately 6 feet long, and mounted on 4 legs that raise it to a height where a seated person's feet don't touch the ground. The upper edge, the peak of the triangle, is not sharp like a blade, but it's narrow, perhaps 2 inches wide at most, sometimes less. This narrow edge is what the prisoner will sit on. The construction uses oak or similar hardwood. The peak can be left as plain wood or sometimes fitted with a metal edge. Some versions have the peak edge deliberately roughened or notched to increase discomfort. The legs are sturdy, bolted, or pegged together because the structure needs to support a human body's weight plus additional load from added weights. The victim is brought to the device stripped of clothing from the waist down. They're positioned to straddle the wooden beam as though mounting a horse. But there's no saddle, no cushioning, just the hard, narrow edge pressing upward into the perineum, the area between the genitals and anus, one of the most nerve-dense regions of the human body. As the prisoner is positioned, their full body weight begins to rest on this narrow edge. The pressure is immediate and intense. The perineum contains major nerves, including the pudendal nerve, which supplies sensation to the genitals and anus. It contains blood vessels. It contains thin skin over structures that aren't designed to bear weight from above and below simultaneously. The prisoner can initially shift slightly, can try to distribute weight, can attempt to find a position that's less agonizing. But there is no less agonizing position. The wooden edge presses upward regardless of how they position themselves, and their feet, dangling on either side of the beam, can't reach the ground to provide any weight relief. Then, weights are added to the ankles, iron weights, stone weights, sometimes simply bags of sand. 5 pounds initially, then 10, then 20. Each additional weight increases the downward force on the perineum, pressing it harder against the wooden edge. The tissue compresses, blood flow cuts off, nerves are crushed. The pain escalates from severe to excruciating to unbearable. Genital trauma in both men and women was immediate and severe. For men, the wooden edge pressed directly on the scrotum and base of the penis. The testicles, compressed between the hard edge and the pelvic bone, were crushed. Testicular rupture was common with heavier weights. The penis, compressed and with blood flow cut off, swelled grotesquely. Permanent damage to erectile tissue was typical. For women, the edge pressed on the labia and clitoris externally, and through the perineum exerted pressure on the vaginal and rectal walls internally. The external tissue, trapped between wood and bone, was crushed. The internal organs, compressed from the external pressure, could suffer prolapse or tearing. Damage to the pelvic floor muscles that support internal organs was common. Internal injuries from prolonged pressure accumulated over hours. The wooden horse wasn't a quick torture. Sessions lasted half a day. A few documented cases describe prisoners left on the device overnight. During these extended sessions, the continuous pressure caused tissue death from lack of blood flow, internal bleeding from ruptured blood vessels, nerve damage that would be permanent. The public humiliation component was significant. The wooden horse was often used in semi-public spaces, not in hidden torture chambers, but in courtyards and rooms where other prisoners could see, sometimes in public squares. The prisoner, naked from the waist down, straddling the beam with weights hanging from their ankles, was a spectacle. The degradation was part of the punishment. This visibility served the Inquisition's purposes. It warned others what resistance cost. It associated heresy with sexual humiliation, reinforcing the idea that religious deviation was linked to moral corruption and sexual sin. And it broke the prisoner not just through pain, but through shame. Time spans varied by the prisoner's stamina and the inquisitor's patience. The minimum effective session was about 90 minutes, long enough to cause significant pain and trauma, but short enough that most prisoners survived. Maximum documented sessions approached 12 hours for particularly resistant prisoners, or particularly vindictive inquisitors. Most confessions occurred between the 2 and 4 hour marks. By that point, the pain was overwhelming. Tissue damage was severe, and the prisoner understood that this would continue indefinitely until they said the required words. Those who resisted past 4 hours were either extraordinarily stubborn or had reached a state where pain had pushed them beyond the ability to make rational decisions. Anatomical damage descriptions from physicians who examined prisoners after wooden horse torture are clinical and disturbing. Tissue necrosis in the perineal area, avulsion of genital skin, hematomas the size of fists, urethral damage causing inability to urinate or blood in urine, rectal prolapse, pelvic fractures in extreme cases where very heavy weights were used. Valencia, 1506. A man named Gonzalo, accused of sodomy, subjected to the wooden horse with 40 pounds of weight added progressively over 3 hours. The record states he confessed to unnatural acts with another man. After 2 hours, but the torture continued until he named his partner. He provided a name. Both men were burned at the stake. The physician's examination of Gonzalo before execution noted severe damage to the privy parts, such that he could not walk and required assistance to stand. Zaragoza, 1530. A woman named Leonor, accused of sexual relations outside marriage and heretical beliefs. She was placed on the wooden horse for 4 hours with 30 pounds total weight. She confessed after 90 minutes, but refused to name the man involved. Weights were increased. She named him after 3 hours. He was arrested and tortured separately. Both were reconciled. The record notes Leonor suffered permanent injury to her womanly parts and was unable to bear children thereafter. Recovery impossibility statistics are difficult to establish precisely, but medical examinations and follow-up records suggest that 7080% of prisoners subjected to the wooden horse suffered permanent disability or dysfunction. Many couldn't walk normally. Many lost sexual function. Women often couldn't bear children. Men often lost the ability to achieve erection. Incontinence was common in both sexes. The wooden horse exemplifies the Inquisition's willingness to destroy the most intimate parts of human identity. It wasn't enough to break will or extract confession. They targeted sexuality, reproduction, the body parts associated with both pleasure and procreation. The message was clear. If you use your body in ways the Inquisition considers sinful, your body will be destroyed in precisely those areas. And like all Inquisition tortures, it was legal, documented, approved. Physicians examined victims before and after to certify that torture was moderate and appropriate. Notaries recorded duration, weight amounts, confessions obtained. The bureaucracy transformed sexual violence and genital mutilation into procedural routine. The wooden horse, unlike the rack or the wheel, doesn't feature prominently in museums or popular understanding of Inquisition torture, perhaps because the damage it caused is too intimate to discuss comfortably. Perhaps because acknowledging that religious authorities systematically destroyed people's genitals and sexual function is too disturbing to incorporate into sanitized historical narratives. But the device existed. The records document its use, and the people who experienced it, the ones who survived, carried the damage for the rest of their lives in the most personal, most private parts of their bodies. The device is specifically engineered for the tongue. It resembles a larger, more robust version of the standard pair of anguish, but with modifications that make it suitable for oral insertion. The metal segments are thicker, the expansion mechanism is more powerful, and the overall construction is designed to withstand the pressure of jaw muscles attempting to expel it. The The iron clamp mechanism consists of 2 or 3 metal segments that fold together when compressed. At the narrow end is a screw assembly with a handle or wing nut that the torturer can grip and turn. When closed, the device is approximately 2 inches long and 1 inch in diameter, small enough to be forced into a mouth. When fully expanded, it can reach 4 or 5 inches in width. The prisoner's mouth is forced open. If they resist, assistants hold the jaw or use a mouth gag, a metal device that wedges between the teeth and forces the jaw to remain open. Once the mouth is accessible, the tongue tierer is inserted in its closed position. The device is positioned over the tongue, the metal segments gripping the tongue from above and below. Then the screw is turned. The segments begin to separate, expanding outward. But unlike the standard pear, which simply opens, the tongue tierer has internal teeth or ridges that bite into the tongue tissue as it expands. These ridges prevent the tongue from slipping free. The tongue is held firmly as the device opens wider. The extraction process has 2 variants. In the less severe version, the device is expanded until the tongue is crushed and mangled, but not completely removed. The segments press outward, compressing the tongue between them, tearing blood vessels, crushing muscle tissue, destroying taste buds and the surface papillae that give the tongue its texture. This version leaves the tongue attached but permanently damaged. In the more severe version, full extraction is the goal. The device expands until it has a firm grip on the tongue. Then it's pulled. Not a quick yank, but a steady, forceful pull. The tongue is anchored to the floor of the mouth by the lingual frenulum, a thin membrane, and by muscles that attach to the hyoid bone in the mandible. Extracting the tongue means tearing these attachments. The tongue doesn't come out easily. It's a muscular organ firmly rooted in the oral cavity. The torturer must pull with significant force. Sometimes the frenulum tears first, sometimes the muscular attachments fail, sometimes, in incomplete extractions, the tongue tears partway down its length, leaving a portion still attached while the front half is removed. Bleeding and choking hazards were the immediate life-threatening complications. The tongue is highly vascular. Extracting it or severely damaging it causes massive hemorrhaging directly into the mouth. The prisoner's mouth fills with blood. They're choking, drowning in their own blood, unable to spit effectively because the tongue, which is essential to the spitting mechanism, is destroyed or gone. Many prisoners died during the procedure from asphyxiation on blood. Others survived the immediate extraction, but died hours later from continued bleeding that couldn't be adequately controlled with 16th century medical knowledge. Cauterization with hot irons was sometimes attempted, but cauterizing the raw wound where a tongue had been was as likely to kill from shock as to save from blood loss. Speech loss was total and permanent for those who survived full extraction. The tongue is essential for forming most speech sounds. Without it, only vowel-like sounds are possible, and even those are distorted. Survivors of full tongue extraction could never speak clearly again. They communicated through gestures, through grunts and moans that others had to learn to interpret. Feeding difficulties were severe and lifelong. The tongue is essential for moving food around the mouth, for chewing, for swallowing. Without a tongue, eating requires modified techniques, tipping the head back to let gravity move food down the throat, consuming only soft foods that don't require chewing, eating very slowly to avoid choking. Survivors often lost significant weight. They couldn't eat enough to maintain proper nutrition. Dehydration was common because drinking was difficult. The simple pleasure of eating, of tasting food, was destroyed forever. Food became pure sustenance, joyless and difficult. Infection in the oral cavity was nearly universal. The mouth contains enormous bacterial populations under normal circumstances. A massive open wound where the tongue had been was immediately colonized by these bacteria. Oral infections are painful and dangerous. The proximity to airways means swelling can compromise breathing, and the proximity to the brain means infections can spread to cause meningitis or brain abscesses. Punishment for blasphemy specifically made tongue removal symbolically appropriate in the Inquisition's logic. If a person used their tongue to speak against God, against church doctrine, against religious authority, then the tongue itself was the instrument of sin and must be removed. The punishment fit the crime in a grotesquely literal way, but tongue tearing was also used for other speech-related offenses: teaching heretical doctrine, spreading Lutheran or Protestant ideas, translating the Bible into vernacular languages without authorization, criticizing the Inquisition itself. Any crime involving words could justify tongue extraction. Survivors' post-torture lives were marked by permanent disability and social isolation. A person without a tongue couldn't participate in normal social interaction, couldn't conduct business that required negotiation, couldn't testify in court, couldn't recite prayers in church, couldn't confess sins to a priest. They became functionally mute, dependent on others for communication. The social stigma was intense. Everyone who saw a person without a tongue knew they'd been punished by the Inquisition for crimes of speech. The missing tongue was visible evidence every time they opened their mouth. They couldn't hide their history. They were marked forever. Toledo, 1486. A former priest named Diego, accused of denying transubstantiation. He'd argued publicly that the communion bread didn't literally become Christ's body. This was heresy. His tongue was torn out using a variant of the mouth pair. The record notes he was unable to speak thereafter and made pitiful sounds when attempting to communicate. He was kept in Inquisition prison for 2 more years before being burned at the stake. The tongue extraction wasn't his sentence. It was part of the interrogation process that preceded his execution. Córdoba, 1501. A woman named Beatrice, accused of teaching Jewish prayers to children in her neighborhood. She was subjected to the tongue terror in its crushing variant. Not full extraction, but severe damage. The record states the device was expanded to the 3rd increment, and her tongue was greatly injured such that she could not speak clearly and drooled continuously. She was reconciled and released, but could no longer teach. Could barely communicate. A later record mentions she died within 2 years from wasting sickness, being unable to eat sufficiently. Zaragoza, 1525. A converso merchant named Abraham, accused of blaspheming Christ. His tongue was fully extracted. The procedure took the length of time to recite the credo twice, approximately 5 minutes of pulling and tearing. The physician present noted great bleeding, which was controlled with hot irons. Abraham survived the procedure but died 6 days later. The official record states fever and corruption of the flesh in the mouth. The mouth pair variant, designed for tongue torture, represents one of the Inquisition's most symbolically loaded methods. The tongue gives humans the power of speech, the ability to express thoughts, to communicate complex ideas, to question, to argue, to blaspheme. Taking the tongue was taking that power away. It was silencing dissent in the most literal, most permanent way possible. And it was public in its effects even when the torture itself was conducted in private. The prisoner returned to society, unable to speak. Their silence advertised their crime to everyone who encountered them. The missing tongue was a sermon without words about the cost of speaking against the church. The device occasionally appears in museum collections, though it's often mislabeled or confused with the standard pair of anguish. The distinction matters. The standard pair was designed for insertion into various body orifices. The mouth pair was specifically designed to destroy the tongue. A different purpose, a different symbolism, a different category of cruelty. When you see one in a museum, remember it's not just a tool for causing pain, it's a tool for stealing voice, for transforming a speaking person into a mute one, for ensuring that certain ideas, certain questions, certain criticisms would never be spoken aloud again. The tongue terror didn't just punish heresy, it prevented future heresy by destroying the organ that could express it. The latter is a vertical stretching device, essentially the rack reimagined in a vertical orientation. It consists of a wooden frame approximately 8 feet tall mounted upright, against a wall or on a freestanding support. The frame has rungs or attachment points at intervals from bottom to top. Ropes threaded through pulleys at the top of the frame allow for mechanical advantage in creating upward tension. The prisoner's wrists are bound together and attached to the rope that runs through the top pulley. They're positioned standing at the base of the ladder. Then the rope is pulled, lifting their arms overhead, and eventually lifting their entire body until their feet leave the ground and they're hanging suspended vertically. This initial suspension is similar to the strappado, but with the arms positioned in front of the body rather than behind. The shoulders still bear the full weight, but the joint angle is different, less immediately damaging than the behind-the-back position of the strappado. But the latter's torture isn't in the suspension itself. It's in what comes next. Incremental adjustment of tension is achieved through the pulley system. The torturer pulls the rope tighter, raising the prisoner's body higher. But simultaneously, the prisoner's ankles are tied to a fixed point at the base of the ladder. As the upper body is pulled upward and the ankles remain fixed below, the body stretches vertically. The spine elongates first. The vertebrae separate. The intervertebral discs, the gel-filled cushions between each vertebra, compress vertically and bulge horizontally. The ligaments that run along the spine and hold adjacent vertebrae together stretch beyond their normal range. The spinal column, which normally has natural curves, straightens under the tension. Vertebrae separation is measurable. Historical accounts mention prisoners being stretched by several inches. This isn't exaggeration. The human spine can elongate significantly when sufficient force is applied. The spaces between vertebrae can increase from a few millimeters to a centimeter or more. Multiply that across 24 vertebrae and you get 2 to 3 inches of total elongation. The annulus fibrosus, the tough outer ring of each intervertebral disc, can tear. When it tears, the gel-like nucleus pulposus inside the disc can herniate, bulging out and pressing on spinal nerves. This causes radiating pain down the limbs, numbness, tingling, and can eventually lead to paralysis if the nerve compression is severe enough. Rib cage expansion injuries occurred because the ribs attach to the thoracic vertebrae. As the spine elongates, the ribs are pulled, stretching the costovertebral joints where ribs meet vertebrae, and the costochondral joints where ribs meet the sternum. These joints can separate or fracture under sufficient tension. Some prisoners developed rib fractures that punctured lungs. Internal organ damage was less obvious, but potentially fatal. The organs are suspended within the body cavity by mesenteries, thin membranes containing blood vessels and nerves. Extreme vertical stretching pulls on these mesenteries, stretching blood vessels, potentially causing internal hemorrhaging. The diaphragm stretched between its attachments to the ribs and its central tendon can tear. The stomach and intestines, suspended by their mesenteries, can twist or suffer reduced blood flow. Comparison to the horizontal rack reveals interesting differences. The rack applies tension in both directions simultaneously, pulling arms and legs apart. The ladder applies tension in one direction only, upward, but uses the prisoner's own body weight as the counterforce. This means the ladder can achieve similar total stretching with less mechanical advantage required. Gravity does part of the work. The ladder also allows the torturer to add incremental tension more precisely. With the rack, each turn of the crank adds a fixed amount of tension. With the ladder, the rope can be pulled inch by inch, allowing fine control over how quickly the damage progresses. This made the ladder particularly suitable for graduated torture, where the Inquisitor wanted to give multiple opportunities for confession before causing irreversible damage. Height increase documented in victims is one of the strangest aspects of ladder torture. Prisoners measured before and after torture were sometimes found to be taller. Not permanently. The elongation was elastic to a point, and the spine would compress back toward normal height over time. But immediately after torture, the forced spacing of vertebrae meant they were measurably taller. This height increase was sometimes used as evidence that the torture had been moderate. Look, the Inquisitors would argue, the prisoner is intact, even slightly improved in stature. The fact that this improvement came from tearing spinal ligaments and herniating discs was conveniently ignored. Paralysis cases recorded in the historical documents are among the most tragic outcomes. A prisoner stretched on the ladder until spinal nerves were damaged severely enough to interrupt signals to the legs. They survived the torture but lost the ability to walk. In the 16th century, this was essentially a death sentence. Paraplegics had no wheelchairs, no physical therapy, no medical interventions. They became bedridden and usually died within months from complications. Barcelona, 1518. A university student named Mateo, accused of possessing prohibited books, texts by Erasmus and other authors on the Index of Forbidden Books. He was stretched on the ladder for approximately 45 minutes. The record states he was raised from the ground by 3 feet and held in that position while questioned. He confessed to owning the books and named the bookseller who'd supplied them. He was reconciled. The record notes, He complained of pains in his back for many years after, and that he stood noticeably taller than before his arrest, though bent forward at the spine. Seville, 1490. A woman named Catalina, accused of secretly practicing Jewish rituals. She was subjected to the latter for 2 sessions. First session, 30 minutes, no confession. Second session. 1 hour, she confessed and named her mother and 2 sisters as co-conspirators. All 3 were arrested. Catalina was reconciled. A physician's examination months later noted she has lost sensation in her left leg below the knee and walks with a pronounced limp. A blacksmith named Pedro, accused of making satirical comments about the Inquisition. He was stretched on the ladder until, according to the record, a cracking sound was heard and he cried out that he could not feel his legs. He had confessed before this point, but the torture continued for unknown reasons. Perhaps the Inquisitor didn't believe the confession was complete. Pedro never walked again. He died in Inquisition prison 8 months later. The official cause: natural causes. The latter represents the Inquisition's technological creativity in finding new ways to apply the basic principle of stretching a human body past its structural limits. They had the horizontal rack. But someone looked at it and thought, what if we did this vertically? What if we used gravity as an accomplice? And the latter was born. The vertical orientation had psychological effects too. A prisoner on a horizontal rack could see their body stretched out before them, could watch their arms and legs being pulled. But a prisoner on the ladder, hanging vertically, often couldn't see what was happening to their lower body. They felt the stretching, felt the pain, but couldn't visually confirm how far they'd been elongated. This uncertainty added its own layer of psychological distress. The ladder also allowed for longer suspension times than the strappado because the joint angle was less immediately destructive to the shoulders. A prisoner could hang from the ladder for an hour or more before shoulder damage became critical, whereas the strappado caused shoulder dislocation in minutes. This meant the ladder could be used for extended questioning sessions, where the pain was maintained at a high level for longer periods. The ladder is less famous than the rack, but it was arguably as common in Spanish Inquisition chambers. It required less floor space than a horizontal rack, important in cramped castle dungeons and monastery basements. It could be mounted against existing walls, and it was effective, producing confession rates comparable to the rack while using simpler mechanics. Some ladders still exist in preserved torture chambers in Spain. Museo de la Inquisición in Seville has one. Plain wooden construction, worn smooth from use. The pulley's still functional after 500 years. Stand next to it and imagine yourself bound to it, feet fixed to the bottom, arms pulled upward, spine elongating, vertebrae separating. Unable to do anything but hang and hurt and wait for the questions to stop or the pain to end through confession. That's what the ladder was. A vertical rack, a gravity-assisted stretcher, a device that used the prisoner's own weight against them, transforming mass into suffering, turning the universal force that holds us to earth into an instrument of torture. The brodicons are boot-shaped devices constructed from wood or iron, designed to encase the lower leg from ankle to knee. They consist of 2 main components, an inner boot that the leg fits into and an outer frame that surrounds it. The space between inner boot and outer frame is where the torture occurs. The wooden or metal boot construction varies by region and era. Earlier versions were typically wood, oak or walnut planks carved and fitted together. Later versions incorporated iron plates and hinges. The principle remained constant: create an enclosed space around the leg that can be progressively filled with material that causes compression. The prisoner is seated and their legs are placed into the boots. The boots are tightened around the legs, not crushingly tight initially, just snug enough to prevent the leg from being withdrawn. The feet rest in the bottom of the boots. The top of the boot ends just below the knee. The leg is now encased, immobilized, vulnerable. Wedge insertion between boards is the mechanism of torture. Thin wooden or metal wedges, tapered from thick to thin, are driven into the space between the inner boot surface and the leg. The wedges are positioned vertically along the length of the boot. A mallet or hammer drives them downward. The first wedge is inserted and tapped gently until it's snug against the leg. It causes pressure, but not yet pain. This is the warning. The Inquisitor asks questions. This is your opportunity. Confess now before it gets worse. When confession doesn't come, the wedge is driven deeper. Hammer blows drive it down, forcing it into the narrow space between wood and leg. The wedge compresses the calf muscle against the shin bone. The pressure builds. The muscle has nowhere to go. It's trapped between the wedge and the bone, being compressed, losing circulation. Progressive crushing of feet and legs occurs as more wedges are added. The second wedge goes in. More pressure. The third. The fourth. Each wedge multiplies the compressive force because they're all acting simultaneously. The leg tissue, skin, fat, muscle, compresses further. Blood vessels collapse. Nerves are crushed. The bone fragmentation process begins when compression exceeds what soft tissue can absorb. The wedges are now pressing directly on bone, transmitting force through the compressed muscle and skin. The tibia and fibula, the two bones of the lower leg, begin to crack under the pressure. Bones don't shatter immediately. They develop stress fractures first, fine cracks that web across the bone surface. These fractures are excruciatingly painful. Each hammer blow that drives the wedges deeper propagates the cracks, extends them, creates new ones. The prisoner feels and hears their own bones breaking, a sickening crunching sensation that comes from inside their legs. The number of wedges, indicating severity, was standardized in some Inquisition tribunals. 4 wedges. Ordinary torture. 8 wedges. Extraordinary torture. 12 or more wedges, reserved for the most serious heresies or the most resistant prisoners. Each additional wedge caused exponentially more damage, because the leg tissue was already maximally compressed. Additional wedges meant the bones themselves had to deform and break. Some records mention the question ordinary and extraordinary, referring to the number of wedge blows. The ordinary question might be 4 to 6 wedges. The extraordinary question could be 10 to 12 or more. The language sanitized the reality. The question was a bureaucratic euphemism for systematically crushing someone's legs until they confessed. Permanent mobility loss was universal for prisoners subjected to the Brodequins with more than a few wedges. The combination of crushed muscle, collapsed blood vessels, nerve damage, and bone fractures meant the legs never functioned normally again. Many prisoners couldn't walk at all afterward. Those who could walk did so with pronounced limps, with constant pain, often requiring canes or crutches. The muscle damage alone was crippling. Compressed muscle tissue, deprived of blood flow for the duration of the torture, developed necrosis. Dead muscle doesn't regenerate. The leg becomes permanently weakened, unable to bear weight properly, unable to generate normal force for walking or standing. The bone fractures, when they healed incorrectly. Medieval medicine had no way to properly set and stabilize multiple fractures in the tibia and fibula. The bones healed in whatever position they'd been crushed into, often resulting in deformity. Legs that bent at abnormal angles, bones that healed overlapping, creating shortened limbs. French Inquisition adoption of the Brodequins made them particularly well documented. The French kept meticulous records. The procedural manuals specified exactly how many wedges for what offenses, how hard to strike each wedge, how to recognize when the prisoner was approaching shock or death. The bureaucratization was complete. The French also developed variations. The Spanish boots were similar but used heated iron boots instead of wood. The Scottish boot variant used a single large boot that enclosed both legs together, crushing them against each other as well as against the boot interior. Detailed procedural records survive in French archives and some Spanish archives. These document not just that the Brodequins were used, but how they were used. The records include the number of wedges applied, the duration of torture, the point at which confession occurred, the physical condition of the prisoner afterward. Toulouse, 1560. A Protestant minister named Jean, accused of heresy for refusing to recognize papal authority. He was subjected to 8 wedges. The record states he resisted until the 6th wedge, at which point there was heard a great cracking from within the boots. He confessed and recanted his Protestant beliefs. He was reconciled, but the examination notes he had crushing injuries to both legs, with bones felt to be broken beneath the skin. He never walked without crutches again. Paris, 1610. Later period, but using methods developed during earlier Inquisition era. A woman accused of witchcraft was subjected to 12 wedges. The record states she confessed after the 8th wedge, but continued to deny certain specifics. The torture continued. By the 12th wedge, the boots contained much blood, and the prisoner had swooned. She survived, but lost the ability to walk. A later notation mentions she died in prison from fever related to corruption of the leg wounds. Pamplona, 1530. A Judaizer named Samuel, subjected to the Brodikins. 6 wedges applied. He confessed to practicing Jewish rituals in secret and named 9 other families. All were arrested. Samuel was reconciled. The record notes his legs remained swollen and discolored for many weeks, and he walked thereafter with 2 staves and great difficulty. The Brodikins represent the Inquisition's systematic approach to destroying specific body parts to extract information. They didn't need to kill. They didn't even need to risk killing. They just needed to destroy the legs thoroughly enough that the prisoner would say anything to prevent further damage.